everyone, my name is Abra Berens. I'm a Michigan-based chef and former farmer, and I'm here to talk you through unpacking and processing your CSA box. So this is our CSA box. I work at Granor Farm in Three Oaks, Michigan, and it's very similar to what you're getting from Keep Growing Detroit now. In here is a whole smattering of different vegetables. So I find that the best thing to do on the day that you get your CSA so that you don't waste any of the food is just to pull it all out of the box, look at it, and see what you're working with. So the first thing on top, some carrots. And I like to kind of group things by family or by kind of organization. Here's a bunch of kale. We've got some salad greens. Got a thing of cherry tomatoes, some big slicing tomatoes, some scallions, some more greens, some cabbage, microgreens, got an eggplant, an onion, some cucumbers, and some zucchini and summer squash. And while this is more than may be in any given box, I wanted to just showcase kind of a variety of different produce that you could be getting throughout the season. In general, I like to think about them, like I said, kind of grouped into families. So let's look at the greens family first. So I like to differentiate greens between super hardy greens, something like cabbage or kale or chard, is a little bit different than something like salad greens. And you can kind of tell the difference if you're not familiar with an ingredient, if it's a hardy green or a tender green, just by feeling the leaves. I mean, these leaves are really thick, they're gonna last really well, they've got this outside, and then inside the head is really dense and tight, and you can feel it just by pressing on it. So that's gonna be the hardiest of the greens. And cabbage is one of those greens that can store for months on end. So it's easy to, just pop it into your fridge and it could live there for a couple of months, no problem at all. And then we've got things, the next hardy are things like kale and this chard. So you can tell the difference between these two leaves just by feeling it. Still a little bit firm, waxy, not super tender, but not as rigid and stiff as this. And you can kind of think of that as being how strong the vegetable is based on the greens themselves. Same is true for this Swiss chard. But then when we get into something really light and delicate, like these salad greens, you can feel the leaves are really tender and light. They don't have that same waxy coating, and they're gonna go a little bit sooner. So I like to line them up. And then the most tender of all of the greens are these little baby microgreens. And these are just little sprouts. So they're the very first leaves that come up after the seeds are germinated, and these are gonna be the most delicate of all of the greens. So when you think about what you're doing when you're unpacking your box, you're really looking at which things need to get used up first. And the way that I kind of decide what needs to be used up first is what's gonna last the longest because it's the hardiest, or because it has a little bit of damage to it. So all of these greens are looking like they're in really good shape. If you were to get a bag of greens, say for example, like this bag of kale, which looks really good and fluffy, but you've got a couple of leaves in here that are starting to go yellow, so you can see the difference between these two leaves. This is something that I would identify as this needs to be used up a little bit faster than something like this over here, which is gonna be nice and healthy and hardy. So that's the way that I think about the greens section. And after you get everything unpacked, you can kind of think about how you wanna store it. And in general, I think that there's a lot of research and work that's been done in grocery stores to store produce as effectively as possible. So if you're unsure, my rule of thumb is how is it stored at the grocery store? So greens are always kept in refrigeration because the cells are so fragile. So you want to keep the water that's in the cells as constant as possible. But the things that will hurt it are, just like on a hot day outside, plants tend to go a little bit limp and wilty. The same thing will happen if the greens are left in the heat or if they're wind whipped by the fans that are in a refrigerator. So I always cover greens in plastic, or you can wrap them in newspaper or wax paper or something like that, or in a produce bag. It's a really great way to repurpose plastic bags that are already in your house. And that'll keep that wind off from the greens so that you're not losing moisture from the fan. So I say for greens, keep them cold and keep them protected. That is greens. And then after that, let's go into the summer produce. So things like tomatoes, eggplant, and zucchini, all of these like to be stored at room temperature. So if they are a plant that doesn't come on until the high heat of summer, generally the fridge is not their friend. And you can store them just at room temperature. I leave them open to the air so they can get good airflow and breathing. Sometimes if you put them into a plastic bag and then even leave them on the counter, they're going to respirate a little bit of moisture, and then it'll create kind of like a mold setting, or you're more likely to get mold or rot in them. So for any of these produce, the real high summer produce, I just leave them at room temperature. It's best to keep them out of direct sunlight so that you're not getting them baked on the counter if possible, but anywhere where there's good airflow. The other thing to look at is, as you're going over stuff, does anything have any damage? So these tomatoes look great. There's no blemishes or puncture marks. Sometimes you get a little puncture from the stem hitting it or something like that. With the cherry tomatoes, sometimes you'll find some that have little wrinkly bits or divots or something like that. And that's all a sign of age, or that you got some sort of damage on it. And anywhere that there's damage, it's more likely to allow bacteria or pests in, which will degrade the quality of the produce. So if you have something that looks like it's showing damage, like this eggplant has a little bruise right there, I would use this sooner rather than later, because this soft spot, you can see how it's giving, is gonna eventually allow rot to start, and then rot will spread. So I would either use this first on the list, or I would pop it into a fridge, even though it doesn't generally like the fridge, just to slow down that rot. But no matter what, I would try to use it in the next couple days. If it didn't have that bruise, I would say eggplant and tomatoes all last, about a week and a half or so without any trouble, just on the counter. And then the same is true for this zucchini. So this one has a little bit of dirt on it, but it's not damaged. So you can just kind of rub it off, wash it off. This zucchini has a little brown spot here and a little bit of pock marking here, which means that it's losing some moisture. We also have a little spider friend there. So with zucchini like this, I generally don't wash this stuff until I'm about to eat it. There's a waxy coating on the outside of these vegetables that's going to help protect it. It's their natural sort of moisturizer. And so we want to keep that intact. And so I like to just leave them as they are on the counter or in a drawer, kind of out of direct sunlight. Something like cucumbers, so again, here's one that I would use right away because it has this gouge taken out, which if it had healed over in the field like that one did, that's pretty firm and you're not gonna have much damage, but this one is softer and more open, so I would use this one first. And then also, cucumbers have so much water in them that they generally benefit from being in refrigeration. And that just helps keep all of the cells nice and plump and firm. So anytime you're seeing nice, tight, clean skin like that, it means that the produce is just picked, super fresh, and you don't have to worry. You've got some time before it needs to be used up. So that is the bulk of summer produce. And then I like to go into things like the root crops. So we've got a bunch of carrots in this box. This is also true for something like potatoes, beets, parsnips, any sort of turnips, rutabaga, all of those things that are big, thick root crops. If they come with the greens on them, to store them, be sure that you're taking those greens off. And it's really easy just to twist them off, or you can cut them with a knife. And I usually try to cut them about a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch above the top. The reason you want to separate the produce from its leaves is because these leaves are trying to move moisture in the plant. And so it will pull moisture from the root out to the leaves, which will make these roots really wobbly and kind of mushy. Right now they're nice and firm, they're super hard, they haven't gone rubbery at all. But if you were to put this whole thing into the fridge, in a couple days, these would be super rubbery. And if you take the leaves off, they'll hold their moisture in the roots for longer. After you take the greens off, you can store them, again, kind of like the cabbage, almost indefinitely. So root crops are generally storage crops because they're biennials. So root crops like carrots, you plant the seed, it grows this, and it has so much energy in its taproot here. The leaves are getting enough solar energy that it's growing these great big roots, and then when it gets cold and the leaves die back, the root is supposed to stay underground and then hold on to it until next spring when it goes through a frost and a thaw. And then all of the energy that's in these carrots is going to send up a new flower shoot. And that flower shoot is going to set the seed. And so what we're doing is trying to capture the energy and the nutrients that are in this taproot before it sends up that flower seed. So when you do put them into cold storage, just keep them at a constant temperature that's above freezing. If they go from cold to warm to cold to warm, that mimics that thawing after winter and spring, and the carrots will start to send out a ton of little hairy roots as they try to dig in, and they'll start to send up new leaves getting ready to send up that flower shoot. And that depletes the energy and the flavor and the texture that's all in these roots. So once you get them cold, keep them cold and take the leaves off. For something like carrot tops, you can certainly use these. They have a nice flavor. A lot of people make carrot top pesto. I like to use them if I'm making like a vegetable stock, or if I'm gonna poach something, I'll put them into the poaching liquid. But things like beet tops can be used the same way that you would use chard or kale. For other tops, potato tops, we don't really use except for sweet potato greens. You can use different things like that. So that is the root crops. And then for our final ones are onions and the allium family. So this is the same family that does garlic and shallots, any of those sort of really aromatic vegetables. For something tender like the green onions, very similar to what we talked about with the salad greens, these are really gentle and tender, and so you want to use these up sooner than something that's considered a storage crop like an onion. If you're going to store these, I would wrap them in plastic, or again, you could wrap them in newspaper or wax paper, and then just keep them protected from the fan but in refrigeration. They're going to start to degrade the soonest at the top. So you can see how these little ends are already starting to kind of pucker and wither. That's just because they've been clipped, so they lost moisture out of it, and that puckering is the plant trying to seal that cut, trying to almost create like a scab to it so that it doesn't keep losing all of that moisture. If you're going to store these for longer than a week or so, I would trim them down to where it gets real firm right about here, and then use these. You can use them again in a stock or a soup or something like that, and then this part of the stock will last longer because it's firmer, it has more density, again like the cabbage, and so it'll last longer without this extra fingers coming off the top. For something like a regular yellow onion, this does not need to be kept in refrigeration. It's again another storage crop just like garlic or shallots or red onion. The difference between a storage onion and a sweet onion is the amount of water that's in its cells. So a sweet onion isn't actually sweeter, it just has more water in it, which dilutes the oniony quality, so it tastes sweeter because it tastes less oniony. The more water in something, the less likely it is to store well. And so sweet onions like Elsa Craig's or Vidalia's or any of those, I keep those in the fridge, but a Spanish yellow onion I keep out on the counter, again, out of direct sunlight and in somewhere where it's a constant temperature. And the same is true for garlic, shallots, red onion, things like that. And then just periodically look at them and see kind of what they're looking like. If you start to notice a smell, or if this isn't a really tight cure, if you've got kind of an open hole, I would use those onions first. And then some of these papers have been pulled away. You can keep them with all of the paper, or you can brush some off. It's up to you. So that's how I unpack a CSA, and I look at it and decide what I'm gonna do. And then oftentimes I'll start to make a list where it says, what are the things that we need to use up the most quickly out of our CSA? So in my mind, what we've looked at, the carrots, those don't have to be used anytime soon. We're just gonna take the greens off and then they can hang out until we're ready for them. Same is true for this cabbage. So we'll put the cabbage over at this end too. And then after that, I would say this big bunch of hardy kale and this big bunch of Swiss chard don't need to be used right away. Neither do this onion or even really the scallions. And then after that, we're getting into some of the things that I would use up. Tomatoes, I mean, often these get used up just because who doesn't eat a bunch of tomatoes as soon as you have them? But those will be kind of in the middle. These summer squash are in good shape. I would use up the eggplant and the cucumbers and these tender greens sooner rather than later. And again, the reason that we're using up the tender greens, the microgreens and the salad greens just generally don't last quite as long. They don't last much more than a week, week and a half. And then we're including this baby kale in this part of it because we've got a little bit of yellowing. So then I'm looking at what I've got to use for the week. I'll start to generate ideas for what we're gonna make for dinner using these things in this order. As far as storage goes, general rule of thumb, if it's going into the fridge, wrap it in something to protect it, again, from that fan. There's the old saying that people use a lot lately, one bad apple spoils the bunch. That's true, not just because it is a bad one that kind of seeps out, but apples actually release a gas that cause the other apples to ripen up and then go off. The same is true for some of these other things. So what I would do next is take this kale, empty it out, and get rid of all of these yellow leaves. Because as soon as these go from just yellowing into like sort of rotty, they're gonna make it a wet environment and they're gonna start to pull all those other good kale leaves to them, and the whole thing will just smell kind of swampy and it's hard to bring it back from that. So sort through this. I would do the same for the lettuce. If you were to have gotten a big head full of lettuce, like a romaine or butterhead, it's sort of up to you what you wanna do. It will store longest as a solid head. But I also find sometimes I get my CSA box and I know I've got a really busy week coming up, and then I'll cut up that head of lettuce and get it washed and into the fridge so that then it's just ready to go. So most produce will last longer in an unwashed state, but if having to wash it every day is gonna keep you from using it, I say wash it all at the beginning. The same is true for this cabbage or this kale. Oftentimes, if it's a whole thing that has to get used up, I tend to, if I'm really tired, just not want to do it. And so if I know that I'm going to have a week where that's going to be likely, I'll go ahead and shred up all of that cabbage and then just have it on hand, add it to salads as we go, add it to different things like that. So after looking at everything that we've got, then I would get everything cut up that I want to cut up into storage the way that I would want it, and then you can start your week of what you're going to make.